Everyone and welcome to the third module of the Docker course. In this module, we will cover the Docker installation and preparation on Linux platform. For this purpose, we will be using the Docker Community Edition. The operations that we cover as a part of this module behave the same way in both Community as well as Enterprise editions. Features specific to Enterprise Edition like the Universal Control Plane and the Docker Trusted Registry would be covered later as a separate module in this course. The agenda for this module includes installation of Docker on CentOS, container operations like how to deploy, login, and exit containers. We will also cover the phases in the container lifecycle, such as running, stopping, and restarting the container. We will learn where the containers are stored on the Docker host. We will gather some information about working with the container host names and more than one container from the same image. We will understand how to collect information and to debug containers using stats and inspect commands. Lastly, we will see how to clean up the Docker host from the containers. So let's get started. Hello everyone. In this nugget, we will learn about Docker installation on Linux platform. A quick note on the Docker Community Edition before we get into details. Docker is available in two editions, that is your Community Edition and Enterprise Edition. Community Edition, also known as CE, is ideal for individual developers and small teams looking to get started with Docker and experimenting with container-based applications. Whereas Enterprise Edition EE is designed for enterprise development and IT teams who build, ship, and run business-critical applications in production at scale. The container engine remains the same in both the editions. Hence, the operations related to Docker images and containers remain the same in both of these editions. Docker Community Edition maintains three streams for the software releases. Stable channel provides the generally made available versions. Test channel releases the builds before general availability for testing purposes. Nightly builds provide the work in progress type of builds for the next major release of the Docker. This slide is about the supported platforms and prerequisites for installing Docker on Linux platforms. Docker can be installed on any version which runs 3.10 or higher version of Linux kernel. Most of the Linux distributions are supported, which include Red Hat Linux, Ubuntu, CentOS, Oracle Linux, SUSE Linux, and many more. Docker is supported on 64-bit architecture-based host. In the last module, we learned that Docker containers use namespaces, control groups, also known as C groups, and union file systems. Hence, the kernel on the host should support these features. In addition to the above, since we are using CentOS for our course, we need to take CentOS version 7 at the host operating system. Let's get to the next slide. Now let's go through the steps required for installation, and we will do it side by side in practice as well. So let me just take you to the host that we have. I have a CentOS 7 host which we will use for installation. So let me just connect to this host using PTT session. Okay, I'll be logging into this. Okay, Saxena. Okay. The very first step in installation process is to install the dependencies, right? So there are three of them. Yum utils provide the Yum config manager utility. Device mapper persistent data and LVM2 are required by the device mapper storage driver. Device mapper enables advanced volume management technologies on the host on which we are going to do this demo. So now let's go and type in, get these things installed. Okay, so we will just type sudo yum install -y is for not prompt, getting prompts, and then yum utils. Also, we want to install the device mapper persistent data, and of course the LVM2. Okay, so this will take up, once it is done, it will go back. Yeah, it will take a couple of seconds to get this entire thing installed on us. Okay, so it is installing all of those things now one by one. Okay, so now set up this stable repository for Docker installation. Okay, so we'll go back again and do this sudo yum config manager, add repo, and we'll be adding the docker ce repo, the URL for that docker ce repo here. Linux CentOS and then docker ce dot repo. Okay, so now the repository information is saved. The nightly and test channels are included in the Docker repository, just disabled by default. So they can be enabled through the command on the Docker host. So let's go ahead and enable these repositories now. So let's first enable the nightly repository. So that for that we can type in sudo yum config manager enable flag can be used, enable the docker ce nightly. Okay, and hit enter. Okay, that is done. Now previously the nightly channel was known as edge channel. Okay, so we see that the information is now enabled. Similarly, let's enable the test repository by typing the, instead of nightly we can just replace it by the test here, and that is also now enabled. But for the demo we don't want to use nightly or test channel for our course, so I'll just disable both of them once again. This is just to show you how to enable them. We needed them disabled, so instead of just enable, just replace enable by disable, and there we go. Okay, so that is disabled now, and similarly, okay, that is disabled now, and similarly we can disable the test. Okay, and hit enter. We can either install the latest version of Docker released, or we can select one of the previously released version. So let's check the available versions that we have to work with on this particular host. So let's go back and check that. Let me clear the screen a bit. So to checking for the available versions, yum list docker ce show duplicates is the flag that we're going to use with this command now, and I'm going to sort it in the descending order. Okay, okay, so here we have all of the different versions that we have. The versions returned are specific to the version on which the command is run. So so in our case the results are specific to CentOS. The return versions are sorted on version numbers, highest to the lowest. Now if I want to install a specific version, I will run the command as, so I will run, if I want to install a specific command, then this will be the command sudo yum install docker ce followed by the version string. In this case, as you can see, the highest version is your 18.9, right? So we'll be using this highest version here. Okay, and after that I also want to go for docker ce cli, again for the highest version, similar number we can use, and then containerd.io. okay, this way we can do that. Now for this, for now we don't let's install the latest release version with the command. If you don't mention any version in that, the latest version is going to be installed, so we can use this command for that. Install docker ce docker CECLI, and container.io. So for all of these things, it is going to install the latest version. On this, I will say yes for the size one. Okay, so it'll take a couple of seconds now. Okay, once again yes. One more. Yeah, and we are okay. So the installation is done. Let me just clear the screen a bit. Now post installation, Docker doesn't start by itself, hence we need to start the Docker service manually. So for that we will go back to the terminal and say sudo systemctl and start the Docker. We can also make it auto startable when the machine reboots. So let's also configure Docker to start at the machine boot. So sudo systemctl enable Docker. Okay, so we are done this way. Now let's test the install by running the container command. So we'll go ahead sudo docker run hello world. Okay, so we have run this container now. Now it's downloading the image from the default registry, and once that is done, we will just look for success message now. Here, if you check out here, it is message displaying the message, which means that the installation is done properly. This way, we can use these basic commands to start the Docker on our host. By default, the Docker daemons always run as a root user. We would like to provide its access to individual users on the host. So on my Docker host, I have logged in as a user Pushpam Saxena. If I run the Docker, let's try running the Docker hello world without the sudo. Let's see what happens. Okay. So it results the permission denied error. So if you want to run the Docker without sudo, then we need to create a Docker group and then add this user to this Docker group. You can add a group using sudo group add Docker. So let's do this on our host now. First, I need to create a Docker group. So sudo group add Docker. Okay. It seems this Docker group is already existing by default, so let's use it. Now let's add the user to this group with the command as sudo usermod -ag. I'm adding to the Docker group user pushpam.saxena. Now this command will add the user to the Docker group. So let's move on. Now in order for this thing to get re-evaluated, log out and log back in so that your group membership is re-evaluated. Otherwise, you can also create a new session and log in with that user. So that also will re-evaluate the user membership. Now let's run the Docker. Let's run the Docker with this particular user now. I'm logging in as Pushpam Saxena, as you can see. Now let's run the hello world Docker as this user. Okay, Docker run hello world. Now command which should result in success. A word of caution here is that the Docker group grants privileges equivalent to root, hence should be exercised with care. Now this is very important concept to understand from examination point of view. Now we can check if the Docker is ready to take commands by running the docker info commands. So now we don't need to use sudo anymore because of all the steps that we have done so far on our host. So let's try that. I will try the docker info command. Right, as you can see, we don't use sudo anymore, and I will more it so that you can see it step by step. This gives the information about the Docker host. So there are 6 containers, right? You can see it gives the login driver, the group C groups driver. It gives the kernel version information, default registry, and lots of other information also. You can also see the product license and all of that stuff. Now there are two other ways of installing Docker. One is by using the RPM packages and the other is by using the convenience scripts. If we cannot use the Docker's repository to install Docker, then we need to download the RPM files for the required release and install them manually. Now here we see the different packages. Here on this we see the different packages. So we need to download the RPMs for the Docker CE, Docker CE CLI and Docker DIO. Also in this case the upgrades need to be managed manually. So now, right, so here you can see all of these RPM files. Now Docker provides convenience scripts at get.docker.com and test.docker.com for installing the nightly and test versions of Docker CE into the development environments quickly and non-interactively. Let's access one such script now. So let's try doing that now. This you can get it from the get.docker. You will see and this is the test.docker, okay, which are the shell scripts. The scripts detect the Linux distribution and configure the Docker accordingly. These scripts install at the dependencies without asking for information. They do not prompt you for anything.